Planning an essay is like planning a road trip. Just as you wouldn't set out on a long journey without a map or a GPS, you shouldn't start writing an essay without a clear plan. In both cases, planning helps you determine your destination, the best route to get there, and what stops or points you want to include along the way. Without a plan, you might get lost, waste time, or miss important landmarks. Planning your essay is essential to ensure it has a logical structure, a clear argument, and that you stay on track throughout your writing journey. My name is Bernadette Tedesco, and in this lesson we're going to be looking at how to plan an essay based on the text We've Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. In this lesson, I'm going to be helping you to identify command, key, and limiting terms within a prompt to help you come up with some really relevant ideas. I'm also going to be showing you how to engage with the topic and how to find your contention. And the other thing I'll be helping you do is help you select your key ideas. Now, all of these things are very important in helping you to plan out the best essay that you can come up with. There are a number of study design dot points that will be covered throughout this lesson. You'll notice on the side here that there might be some purple boxes, and these are some difficult vocabulary that you might need. And there's also some key terms here. Now, in amongst this, there'll be some meta language that will help you to meet that requirement of this study design. I'll also be covering the study design dot point of exploring and analysing explicit and implicit ideas presented in the text, because these are going to be essential in your planning. And I'll also be covering historical context and the social and cultural values in the text, because this is something that you need to also think about when you're planning for your essay. One of the other key design dot points I'll be helping you with is how to plan, construct, and edit an analytical writing text in a way that responds explicitly to a set topic, helps you develop and sustain ideas, explore and refine organisational structure, so planning your structure so that it meets the expectations of an analytical essay. I'll also be looking at demonstrating knowledge of a text. And finally, one of the things that we'll be covering is demonstrating an understanding of the purpose, audience, and context. So knowing and covering all of these study design dot points will help you to succeed in passing this outcome. So I'm going to begin with identifying command, key, and limiting terms. So there are specific terms or words within a prompt that you need to sort of unpack. The command words, the most obvious words to identify, and you'll see these here. They are phrases within an essay prompt that direct you in what you should do. For example, an essay prompt has the words discuss or explore in it. It's asking you to look at a range of possibilities or a range of angles. How would different audiences react, or within different contexts? Or you might even look at multiple possibilities. So you're looking at a range of areas where you would respond to that prompt. If an essay prompt has the words evaluate or is-are, it's actually asking you to look at the validity of the statement. So evaluate how accurate that statement is and to what extent. If a question is asking you whether you agree, it's asking you to come up with a very specific perspective. So you might agree or disagree, or you might be along that spectrum. If it's an agree or disagree sort of question, make sure that you don't sit in the middle. Okay, so what you want to do is you want to say to one side of the question or the other, I mostly agree or I mostly disagree with these exceptions. If a question is asking how or to describe, it's actually asking you to look at author craft. So things like how is the text structured, how are the characters created in order to get a certain idea across. Or it could also be looking at the author's point of view and their views and values. So when you're looking at your essay question, pay specific attention to the command words, because it's going to influence the way you approach the question, especially if it's a how question, because without that how, you might only touch a little bit on the structural elements and the author craft, but if the question is a how question, then you need to make sure that you are explicitly focusing on that in your ideas. The other thing that you want to look for when you're breaking down an essay prompt is what are the key words within it. So keywords are the specific words, the themes, characters, and ideas from the text that you will need to discuss. And then you want to pay attention to the limiting words. Now, limiting words are tricky. Limiting words are words that try to narrow down your response to the prompt, that once you identify them, you realize that it's actually a much broader question than at first glance. They limit the way you respond, and they're usually contentious and offer an opportunity for you to argue with the prompt and add some nuance to your essay. For example, generally they are words that turn the prompt into an extreme statement rather than tempering it with some possibilities. So rather than saying something is, it might say that something is rather than it might be. The addition of the word most or only are two examples where they try to force that really narrow perspective onto a essay prompt idea. There are also times when a limiting word might be trying to force you to see two things as correlating when in fact they're quite different. So for example, by saying 1 and 2 are caused by the same thing, that would be limiting the way that you would respond to the prompt. Let me give you an example. Mary Cat is dangerous and insane. They're two different ideas. She's dangerous? Yes. She's insane? Possibly. But you don't necessarily have to assume with the and that she is both. You could argue differently. The and tries to limit the way you approach the prompt. Or Mary Cat is dangerous because she's insane. So you might, for example, not agree that she's insane or not agree that she's dangerous, but the word because tries to force you to think that both are in relation to each other. That's an example of a limiting word. What I'm going to get you to do is have a look at the activity here, this prompt here. And I want you to try and identify the command words, the keywords, and the limiting words. Underline each in a different colour to complete the activity. Okay, how'd you go? Hopefully you were able to identify the following. For the prompt, We've Always Lived in the Castle examines the consequences of isolation and confinement. Discuss. The most obvious one that you hopefully found straight away was the command word, discuss. And remember that that word is asking you to look at this prompt from a range of angles. Yeah, so what are the range of ways that isolation and confinement have a variety of consequences? The other thing I hope you were able to identify were the keywords, consequences of isolation and confinement. So isolation, being alone, being separated, and confinement, being trapped within an area. Consequences is something that hopefully you didn't miss and you just didn't jump straight to isolation and confinement. So consequences is looking at what occurs because they are isolated and because they are confined. You might have also highlighted examines as a keyword. So examines means to analyse and look closely at. And finally, hopefully you were able to identify the limiting word and the idea that isolation and confinement have the same consequence might be something that you disagree with and want to argue against, that the consequences of isolation can be one thing and confinement is a different thing. So that's a point of contention that you can get some nuance into your ideas. The next thing we're going to look at when approaching an essay topic and coming up with your plan is how to engage with the topic. And to do this, I recommend asking probing questions. So asking probing questions about the prompt helps you to develop your contention. And remember that a contention is a statement that summarizes your main point of view on the prompt. So what do you think or feel about the prompt? And the more questions you ask, the more complex they become. The first couple of questions you ask are going to be the same questions that pretty much everyone asks. But once you force yourself to go beyond those first couple and really break it down a lot, you get some more complex ideas coming out in the questions that you ask. For example, for the topic "We've Always Lived in the Castle" examines the consequences of isolation and confinement discussed, you might ask yourself, what is the difference between isolation and confinement? Who is isolated? And how and why are they isolated? So that would force you to look beyond just the Blackwoods or the sisters, but also to think about the town itself. Who is confined? So who is trapped or closed in by that isolation? And how and why are they confined? What causes them to be confined? Is everyone who is isolated also confined? And this gets you to really think about that limiting word there. Are they necessarily correlating? Is there a correlation between being isolated and being confined? Are they confined because they are isolated? Are the consequences just negative, or can they be positive? And you'll see as I start going further along that there are more and more questions that I'm asking that begin to become quite complex. For example, do you think Jackson agrees with the statement? Or are there different levels of isolation? Yeah. What is Jackson saying about the theme of isolation through these characters? What I'd like you to do now is I want you to expand on the ideas, expand on the questions that I've already asked, and I want you to come up with some more of your own. Using the same prompt as above, brainstorm 3 more probing questions to complete the activity. So you have all of the probing questions that I've already come up with. I want you to come up with 3 more of your own. Good luck. Okay, so how'd you go? Hopefully you were able to come up with at least 3. Here are some more that I came up with that would help me with breaking down the question and thinking about what my contention might be and thinking about how I might answer these questions. Note, these are just some of the possible responses. Your answers might be different, and that's really good. That means you're thinking in that nuanced, sophisticated way about the text yourself. So how does societal context, so the context of it, particularly the small town setting, contribute to isolation? What are the consequences for the villagers? What are the consequences for Uncle Julian? Does the historical context of the novel influence the prompt? And then I might think about McCarthyism or the nuclear family and how that might encourage or enforce that isolation and confinement. So that historical context. Do the power dynamics within the family contribute to the theme of isolation? What role does gender play in the consequences of isolation and confinement? And how do traditional gender roles influence the characters' experiences? So how do the different characters respond to being confined or isolated based on those expectations of the things that they should do? I'm thinking there specifically Mary Cat and Constance, but it could also be some of the males within the town, or even Stella herself from the town. How does the Blackwood house, so there I'm thinking about that symbolism of the house, contribute to the character's sense of isolation and confinement? And what are the moments of empowerment within the novel, and how do they influence the character's experiences of isolation? Are there instances where the characters break free from their confinement? Okay. So all of these extra probing questions are designed to get me to think beyond the most obvious ideas and actually get down to how I personally engaged with the text and the things that I personally am thinking about when I'm approaching this question. The next thing we're going to look at is how to find your contention. And remember that the contention summarizes your main point of view. So you want your contention to be something that you genuinely feel or think. When you've engaged with the key ideas and concerns within the topic and thought about probing questions, you can start to come up with and develop your contention. Remember that your contention is creating an internal dialogue with your own thoughts. So you don't want it to be something too generic. You want it to be something that reflects your own personal perspective on the prompt. You want to focus on ideas and points rather than focusing on examples. So rather than thinking about a particular character, you want to think about an idea. You want to ask yourself those probing questions about the topic to help you deepen your thought, and you want to state your contention clearly in your introduction and reaffirm it throughout your essay. So it needs to be something that doesn't just happen right at the start, but carries through each one of the ideas that you explore. It needs to be able to connect back to your contention. What you don't want to do is just paraphrase the essay topic. So don't just turn the essay topic into a statement without really thinking about your own internal dialogue about it. You don't want to simply agree or disagree. That's a very bland contention, and it's not going to help you really genuinely engage. You don't want to ignore key parts of the essay topic, also known as cherry picking. For example, in the topic that we've been looking at, ignoring the word consequences would be cherry picking, or lumping isolation and confinement together as one idea rather than looking at them as two nuanced ideas or two nuanced themes would be an example of cherry picking. And you don't want to wait until the conclusion to state your contention. You want to make sure that it happens throughout, not just at the end. Now we want to look at selecting our key ideas. So we've come up with our contention, we've got all those probing questions that we've been thinking about. Now we want to unpack why we believe what we believe. Once you've identified your contention, it's time to decide on 3 or 4 key ideas, and each idea will form a paragraph. Use your answers to the probing questions to help you formulate these ideas. And make sure to think about multiple pieces of evidence that you can use to support your idea. Idea only has one example from the text, one moment in the text when it happens. It's probably not going to be a strong idea. So try to move beyond that. Here's an example. So for the prompt, we've always lived in the castle, examines the consequences of isolation and confinement, discuss. This contention here might be something that you build on. The text explores the negative impact of ostracism. So ostracism is deliberately excluding someone from a group. So it looks at the negative impact of that. But it also shows the consequences of isolation and confinement are not always negative. So my contention is saying that there is obviously negative things that happen because of their exclusion from society, but not all of the consequences are negative. There are 3 ideas that I have that will attach really clearly to this contention. My first idea is that self-isolation and confinement provides a sense of freedom and control. So self-isolation, an isolation that you choose rather than one that you're forced into. And there are a couple of different pieces of evidence that I could use to go with this. For example, Mary Catt's routine and rituals offer a sense of control and freedom from gender roles and patriarchal oppression. That's one example of her choosing self-isolation in order to have control over her own life. We also have Constance's control over what she does, where she goes, and who she sees. So she is in control of who she allows into the house, into her isolated confinement, and it also shows that she has control over whether she's forced to see other people or not. The isolation protects her from being vulnerable to that male control. And the third piece of evidence that I might use to support this idea is that the Blackwood house can be seen as a bit of a sanctuary for the sisters. The next idea that I've come up with to support that contention that the text explores the negative impacts of ostracism, but it also shows the consequences of isolation and confinement are not always negative. So the next idea is that community isolation and confinement as a form of punishment and because of elitism. So this shows that forcing confinement and isolation is a negative, and the consequence of this is that it's used as a punishment, and it's because of this idea of the Blackwoods thinking they're better than everyone else. And so they reject the Blackwoods because they feel like the Blackwoods aren't like them. And there are 3 examples here that I can use to support that idea. So I have the community ostracize the sisters as murderers, and it's a collective decision to confine the family socially. So they all of the villagers are involved in this isolating and confining of the Blackwood families and the sisters. The Blackwoods' wealth and social standing cause their isolation, emphasising how the community confinement can be a consequence of these social hierarchies. And in this way, the Blackwood house becomes a symbol of their exclusivity. The rest of the villages are locked out, but it also means that they can only be themselves when closed within. The village is isolated from the rest of America. So because I'm looking at the community, I'm thinking about what other evidence do I have that the community is isolated. And there's this idea that Jackson puts forward that they are isolated and excluded almost as a collective punishment, like they deserve to not be part of the rest of America, like their exclusion. Living within the confines of this small town is a punishment because of their insular way of thinking, rather than thinking about America in broader terms. And the third idea is the psychological impact of isolation and confinement. So I'm looking at the negative impact of ostracism by looking at the psychological impact of their isolation and confinement. So I look at the psychological impact of Mary Cat's cognitive distortions, the way she twists the truth to fit the circumstances that they're living in. We have Constance's anxiety and her agoraphobia. And for this situation, the Blackwood house moves from being a sanctuary to almost a place of horror and fear, that she's afraid of leaving that space. And then we also have the villagers' hostility, that mob mentality and fear, as an example of the villagers succumbing to the psychological impact of being isolated from the rest of the world. They turn into a mob that fears anything that's different within them. What I now have is a contention, and I have 3 ideas, and I've also planned some evidence and examples that can go with each one of those ideas. In planning an essay, I now have a really clear roadmap of where I'm going to go with my essay. So when planning an essay, remember, it's important to know and understand what the command terms are. It's important to engage with the topic. What does it want me to hone in on? What does it want me to resolve? Another thing to think about when planning an essay is that topics are multifaceted and often broad. There are many ways to approach them, especially when you look at those limiting words within it. It really encourages you to think beyond just the most obvious responses. When planning an essay, it's important to formulate a contention and what angle you're going to approach the topic from, and to ask probing questions. That's probably the most important thing to do when planning. Think about what elements of this prompt am I engaging with, and is making me think about the text in a new and interesting way. Your essay plan only needs to make sense to you. You're not assessed on the essay plan. The essay plan is to help you make sense of the prompt and to help you know where you're going to head with your essay without getting lost. These are some of the key terms that we've covered: command words, keywords, limiting words, and contention. Please join me in the next lesson where we're going to look at upgrading your planning.